and welcome to the latest installment of our In-Rehearsal community event. It's a world first. It's our first live slam we've ever had in a community event. And let me introduce you to our guests. To my right, although it may appear to your left, it might be to your, I don't know, it's all going to be anywhere. I have Mark Vernon. Hello, Mark. How are you doing?
Hi there, Ben. Nice to join you from South London.
Great. And I also have Robert, who is beneath me, but he may well be anywhere. How are you doing, Robert?
Trying to keep warm, Ben, in sunny South London as well.
We've really got South London represented here. It almost seems like kind of, I was going to say three wise men, but I'm kind of imposing myself on this group here, maybe in an unwelcome way. But thank you so much, Mark and Robert, for giving up your time and for being part of the In-Rehearsal community. We were having a discussion before we came on how we might want to be introduced and how I might introduce Mark and Robert. And we had discussion. So I now have my formal introduction, which is Mark is a writer and a psychotherapist, and we have Robert, who is a writer and a philosopher and a practical philosopher. That was what we're talking about. Is that right?
Yeah, that's what we're having a go at. Yeah,
we're having a go at. And faces may seem familiar to some of you, or they may not. We have literally just launched to the community library both Robert and Mark's box set, so two amazing box sets and experiences that have gone live in the library literally today, and over the last couple of days they've gone live, where we have Mark, who's focused on spiritual intelligence, which, Mark, I think your book is out now. Is it today or very recently? Your book?
I could quickly reach for one, actually, for the...
Here we go.
For the visual plug as well. There we go.
Excellent.
So spiritual intelligence in 7 steps, which a lot of the video content that we put together with Mark features in that library. Some amazing things. I still think about Kairos, Mark, all the time, like trying to build more Kairos into my life.
So different experiences of time that this, and it's partly to help us think about intelligence, not just in terms of artificial intelligence or rational intelligence, which of course is so dominant. So breaking out of that.
Yeah, that Kairos is brilliant. So if you haven't checked those out yet, those videos, please do. And of course, Robert, it feels like a million years ago that we worked on our content. The new box set, Beyond Ideas. The concept of Beyond Ideas is something that's kind of always very exciting. And the flavor of the things that we talked about, I think we talked about decision making, we talked about intuition, luck, innovation. And I love this idea that innovation can come from within. We just got to get to know the sort of dark, murky sides of our thoughts and our psyche to unlock innovation. So those amazing videos are now available for you to enjoy outside of the slam. Now, gentlemen, I don't know who to... Maybe let me start with you, Robert. What is this idea of the philosophy slam? Where does that idea come from?
Yes. So what does it mean? It's not Mark and me playing basketball, just to reassure everybody, because that would be, well, it might be amusing actually, but it wouldn't be very successful. So the idea really is to bring together two worlds, the world of philosophy, which often is considered to be a bit abstract and a bit dry, with the world of improv, basically. So imagine a really, really unfunny comedy show. That's sort of what we're doing today. I
love that billing.
Yeah.
How enticing for our audience. But now I remember you telling me about the idea when we were sort of talking through the content for the ideas for the content, and you shared this idea. And I think if you haven't already, the videos themselves, it feels very spontaneous and it feels like ideas arriving quite naturally. And I think what a great way to kind of bring the year to a close, then allow us the freedom to kind of spark those neurons and start thinking of different topics and ideas that we might use and might lean on going forward. So you, In-Rehearsal community, I'm trying to make eye contact with every single one of you, which is quite difficult. We're really relying on you for our philosophy slam. You are going to serve up the topics, the ideas, the talking points that are going to spur both Mark and Robert on for this philosophy slam. So if you can start putting maybe topics or ideas into the chat. And very shortly, I'm going to hand over to Robert and Mark, who's going to take this philosophy slam away. But before we came on, I was given a very clear instruction by Mark and Robert. I said, well, you know, they went, well, what happens if the community will be reticent with their ideas? I said, it's unlikely. They're an amazingly vocal bunch. They're going to come up with some amazing ideas and topics to talk about. So as we wait for our in-rehearsal community to suggest some topics and understanding and words or phrases that might trigger our first conversation, I asked you, I said, well, what should I avoid if I have to prompt you? And the question came, do not talk to me about the Kardashians, because we don't know anything about the Kardashians. So I think that's an important instruction, not just for me, but for our in-rehearsal community. So we have a suggestion already, and it's about the Kardashians. No, it's not. I'm only joking.
Okay, thank you, Ben.
Here we go. I'll start with Susan. Susan gets the first. She got in the earliest, so I think let's start with that. What happens to us when we pass away? And Simon's is fantastic. Oh, I mean, they're all wicked now, aren't they? You're off and running. So on that note, I will step away and I shall see you both at the end. Enjoy your time with these two amazing, wise men, and I shall see you at the end. Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Mark.
Thanks very much indeed. Yes, and as Ben says, yeah, you're very welcome to write in the chat anything you like, really. It doesn't have to be a fully formed question. It can be a single word, and it can be, because I'm looking at the rather serious subjects that have already come up, dealing with aging, fuel poverty, what happens to us when we pass away. I mean, goodness me, some pretty heavy stuff. Mark and I would be very happy to delve around in anything dark and tragic, but you're equally welcome to put things in the chat like, you know, avocados or bananas. Actually, it doesn't have to be fruit, but we get asked some pretty silly things as well. Crocodiles, I remember we were once asked about as well. So although we've started off in pretty somber mood there in the chat function, don't let that influence you too much. If you want to say something entirely frivolous, that's fine too. So why are men with bald heads so much more attractive? See, that's an excellent one. So yeah, well, I don't suppose we'll be able to get to every single one, but we'll have a go. Mark, is there something tickling your fancy you want to begin?
Well, look, let's start with Susan, because Susan started first. What happens to us when we pass away? It is something that I've been thinking a lot about, partly because the business of death felt like it came to the fore very much during the COVID years. And as a society, we were very ill-equipped to cope with it beyond medicalising it. And I do work in the NHS, and it was very striking, the stress that doctors and nurses and GPs and so on face, because all the anxiety around death came in their direction. But I think a way of beginning to answer this question, rather than just sort of speculating or coming up with your own sense of things, is to ask how we experience passing away in life before the end of our mortal lives. And there's an ancient understanding called perception by analogy in a lot of wisdom traditions. And this is the idea that actually a lot of experiences have echoes in more than one place. And so a good way of trying to, as it were, look around the corner or over the horizon of life, particularly into death, is to look for analogies in this life. And of course, the psychotherapists amongst us will know that endings are really significant in therapy, how people begin and end sessions, how they approach breaks like Christmas, how they talk about the ways they say goodbye, or of course the deaths that they might have experienced in their family. And this starts to give us a sense, I think, of what it might be to actually pass away, because endings can be traumatic, of course, but there also are new beginnings always. You know, the leaving behind of childhood and entering into the college years, and then the leaving behind of the college years and entering into adulthood, and then maybe this segues into dealing with aging as well. It's another moment in life. And when it's done well, nothing is lost, but everything feeds into the next part of life. but refreshed and renewed and equipping you for that new stage. And so, whilst, of course, I don't know what happens when we pass away, my money is on that it will be a death that's also a new birth, and that what we have become in this life will have quite a strong impact upon what happens, and particularly how we perceive what happens in the next life. That is my thought on what happens when we pass away. No seance, but perhaps something that you can get to know in the here and now. That's rather why I like this approach.
Yes. And actually, Mark, as you said that about seance, I was thinking about this practice that both Mark and I are involved in a little bit called family constellations. Nothing to do with astrology, actually. But you get people, strangers actually, to represent even dead people that you may know. And it's extraordinary how they become animated with as if they're still alive, actually. And so the boundary, even the boundary between life and death might not be quite as impermeable as we think. But look, I'm going to get really, really heavy and dark for a minute before we try and resurface. And I do want to have a look at this question, is water wet? I love that. As well as these other ones about are we living in a simulation and so on? And are we finding the one, Soraya? What is waste? Very, very good. We can talk about that too. Andrea, there's a brilliant book by Mary Douglas on what waste is, by the way. But let me get very, very dark while we're talking about death. And I'm going to invoke the incredibly serious, indeed formidable German 20th century philosopher Martin Heidegger. One of the most interesting thinkers on death, I think, that there is. And he says a few things about death. One is, and here's the most cheery one of all, as soon as we're born, we're old enough to die. Now, that's one to sort of stimulate the Christmas cheer, isn't it? But of course, it's sort of technically he's true. He's right about that, because it's only something that lives that can die. What's already dead doesn't die. What's inert or inanimate doesn't die. So life is the fuel. I'm talking about fuel poverty, but life is the fuel for death. So the moment you're alive, you can die. So that's one of the things he says. Another thing he says is this idea of passing away is a bit confusing or vague, because Heidegger does say, death is not an event in life. So it's not like you go through death. It's sort of, you're either living or you're dead, and death is not an event in death. So it's sort of, again, sort of obvious when you think about it, but kind of mind-bending at the same time, because if death isn't an event, what is it? It's kind of an unhappening. It's an unevent or a de-event or dis-event, whatever you might want to call it. And of course, the other thing, most famously probably for scholars of Heidegger, is that all of our being is what he calls being towards death, or those of you who speak German on the call, zum Todsein, being towards death. And that we're always kind of oriented towards it, whether we like it or not. So that's kind of where we're headed. And he goes so far as to say, actually, death is the only thing we ever really own. And that's because it's the only thing that's entirely unique to me. So say, for example, Mark has an extraordinary background, very, very diverse. One of the things he's been in his amazing career is a priest, in the Christian tradition. And of course, in the Christian tradition, sacrifice is obviously fundamental. But say I wanted to sacrifice myself for Mark, and I would happily do it. He's a good friend. I love him dearly. Technically, for Heidegger, sacrifice is impossible, because say I gave up my life for him, I wouldn't actually be dying his death. I'd still be dying my death. So sacrifice in that sense is a completely impossible concept. I couldn't actually die Mark's death for him, much as I, might want to sort of step in. I could only die my death for him. So that's the very, very serious thing to say. I was going to sort of try and rescue that with something a bit brighter from Freud, because Freud, actually basically says death doesn't really exist, and it's a blip biologically that will end up solving, with enough research on genetics or what have you. So that's a glass half full concept, Simon.
So maybe I could segue and pick up on something of what you were saying there, referring to my past. I used to be a clergy person. The emphasis there is rather on the used to be, but that's another story. But actually, one of the bits that I did, funny enough, enjoy were taking funerals. And I think it's because funerals are a way of approaching something that is very hard to talk about. And this is linking me now to intelligence and also emotional intelligence in the chat, which Hazel and Romina have put up there. And I think that the point here is that whilst we tend to think of intelligence as what's going on inside our heads, there are different kinds of intelligence, emotional intelligence, spiritual intelligence, I would argue. And they're often best embraced by, say, embodied means rather than intellectual means in the narrow usual sense. And so a ritual, for example, like the rituals around a funeral service, can be astonishingly helpful for people trying to grapple with this unspeakable non-event in life, as Robert puts it. And the embodied way of thinking about things is very strikingly helpful. You know, it's the common thought that if you're stuck on something, going for a walk can often help. Or if you want to make a life decision, then try a pilgrimage, which is just a walk, but with an intention where you'll hold what's on your mind in your mind as you walk. And some may be familiar with the work of Ian McGilchrist, the philosopher and psychiatrist, and his great work on the brain lateralization, The Master and His Emissary, and then he's recently published another book called The Matter with Things. But the point is that there is a kind of attention we have, sometimes associated with the right hemisphere, that is much more able to be open to the unknown, the unexpected, the novel, whereas another kind of attention is more focused and specific. And it turns out that the right hemisphere is also very connected to the body. And so doing something with your body, as it were, supercharges that capacity which in a very wordy kind of world can often get lost. So intelligence is multifaceted, and the body is no small part of that. And so getting used to using your body by walking, by movements in particular, and then of course there's lots of embodied practices, is very much part of intelligence, I would like to say. Rituals, lighting candles, this time of year in the run up to Christmas is full of all that because of the darkness, but it's part, I guess, of why this time of year feels so meaningful to people, because we tend to do things that we wouldn't normally do.
That's wonderful. Yeah, there's so many different ways of knowing beyond the kind of cognitive. I want to link two things together, actually. Jesse Woodman, gift giving. I want to connect that with this in-laws thing. Where did I see that? Somebody wrote down in-laws. I expect somebody who's dreading Christmas coming up. Oh, yeah, here's Susie. There we go. I want to link these two things together because I think they're united through the work of he was very famous French anthropologist called Claude Levi-Strauss. But just to say in passing, Antonio Mila, romanticism is dead. I mean, that I hear that as a ironic phrase because romanticism was about the idealization of death in so many ways. There's a very famous painting called The Death of Chatterton, which says that in a sense, romanticism is the glamorization of death. So to say romanticism is dead is actually a way of saying that it's actually alive and kicking. But yeah, well, in-laws and gift giving. These are two subjects which really exercised, I think he's probably the most famous anthropologist known. I mean, he's not with us anymore. But he wrote a lot about in-laws and what he called kinship structures. And he wrote a lot about gift giving as well. And they're a little bit connected because when we acquire in-laws, what happens there is that two families come together. And actually, often in the coming together of two families, there's symbolic gift giving. You know, in traditional societies, that might be a giving of a bounty or a dowry or something, or even usually the wife herself. So there's an exchange of gift giving in the ceremony itself. But the point I want to make really is that this phrase "in-laws" is worth just pondering over, because what happens when you marry somebody else is that it's a legal binding that takes place between two families. And most interestingly, you go from, when you marry somebody, the requirement is that you marry somebody outside of your family. If you marry somebody inside of your family, of course, that's incest. And Levi-Strauss famously wrote about the way in which the incest taboo was the kind of fundamental organizer of social relations. But when you marry somebody, you therefore have to marry somebody outside of your society. It has to be exogamous, to use the technical term. But once you marry them, those of you who have husbands and wives on the call today, they become your family overnight, or in the blinking of an eye, in the moment of the ceremony, through the process of exchange of rings, the giving of rings, for example. So you make somebody your family. Although we think of family as being just a matter of blood and procreation and genetic continuity and so on, and yes, of course, there are examples of adoption and all the rest of it. It's extraordinary that in that moment you can make somebody family, and you make them legally part of your family through this. Mark, you were talking about rituals a moment ago. It's kind of, again, sort of obvious, but sort of mind-blowing in a way that you can legally convert somebody from non-family to family through this service. And in fact, they become your next of kin, not just family, but the closest. Your husband or wife is the closest family to you now, closer than the mother who gave birth to you even. So it's kind of an extraordinary thing. And just on the gift giving thing, so Levi-Strauss talks a lot about how gifts are ways of basically establishing status in a society. And in Anglo-Saxon societies, actually, there was the figure called, in Old English, the Mathum Giver. So the most powerful in the clan was called the Mathum Giver, the gift giver. Not the person who took the most, it was the person who gave the most. And you could say that's paradoxical. Well, obviously, they have the most resources to give, usually. They're the wealthiest, the most abundant, if you see what I mean. But it's also for Levi-Strauss, and he's got, I think, Friedrich Nietzsche in the back of his mind here. The act of giving a gift, obviously enough, indebts them. And once you have somebody in your debt, you hold a kind of power over them. So the action of giving gifts is never really completely neutral. And in fact, Nietzsche goes so far as to say, and it's interesting with Christmas coming up, if you're given a gift, the first thing you have to do, and literally what he says, you must avenge the gift in order to restore parity, or ideally give them something more expensive.
Yeah, Machiavelli has got quite a lot on gift giving. And he says, never be cheap with your gifts, always be extraordinarily generous, and then someone will be in your debt for the rest of your life. So he's the Machiavellian use of gift. But I thought I could pick up on the idea of finding the one, a partner, a sort of related theme to what you've been talking about there, Robert. Partly because this has a history, this idea that there's someone out there for you. And it goes back at least to Plato, who in one of his best known dialogues, the Symposium, which is a gathering with wine to talk about love, a character called Aristophanes, the playwright Aristophanes. Plato gives Aristophanes a myth that sort of tries to describe the extraordinary power of this idea that there's someone out there. And the story goes that originally we human beings were aboriginal wholes, and we were circular, and we had 2 heads and 4 arms and 4 legs, and we span across the face of the earth at great speed, so much so that the gods on Mount Olympus became alarmed. And so Zeus sent down Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, to cut us all in half and stop our power. And when Zeus next looked down upon the earth, he saw these kind of halflings flopping around rather pathetically upon the face of the earth, and so took pity upon us and set back the blacksmith god to do a bit of biology on us so that we could at least walk and we could at least move our hands. And also, if the chance should be that we met our lost half, we will be able to kiss and embrace and make love and experience something of the Aboriginal unity once again. But then there's a third move that Plato suggests, because what happened is that the seemingly lucky individuals that finds their lost half, that finds the one, Zeus notices that they just want to cling to each other for dear life, and they rather lose interest in the rest of the world around them. And so strangely, this reuniting leads to a second half-life, because they've bought into the idea that now they found the one, they found all they need from life. And so Plato is, I think, criticizing what we would call romantic love, to use the R word again, and suggesting that actually love, if it's perceived as just finding the right person, powerful though that is, as if that's the goal or the end of loving, then love will actually fail you. It's a sort of fancy way, I guess, of putting the intuition that when you fall in love, it's wonderful, but probably that experience isn't going to last, and you have to learn to move to what Erich Fromm, the psychotherapist, called standing in love. And standing in love is much more about having had that initiation of love awakening in you, learning with your partner perhaps to turn back into the world and using that love that's awoken to draw you through your desire and longing back to wider reality. And then love can continue, but not because you found the one, but because it's awoken in you the desire to want more and more and more from life, in fact.
Thanks, Mark. It's so nice to be reminded of that Erich Fromm book. I think it's fantastic, fantastic phrase, isn't it? Standing in love. I'm going to move us on again. Try and implausibly connect to rather cheeky contributions. Alexis and Simon. Is water wet? And I am pink, therefore I am. And I think it's the word therefore which unites these two things, because we think of water, is water wet? Well, it must be, because it's water. But of course, technically speaking, what's wet is what's affected by water. So I become wet after I have a shower, for example. I'm wet. The water isn't necessarily wet in and of itself. It's that which causes wetness in something else. So it's a false inference to think of water being wet. The therefore implicit. We're being challenged in the question, is water wet, to challenge the thereforeness in that. What we think of water is wet because it makes everything wet. Well, just because it makes everything wet doesn't mean it's wet itself. We're attributing an essence of water, if you like, a wetness to water, which is a kind of false inference. And it's part of what we called, when I was teaching in students in Oxford, my speciality was sort of literary theory, and there was always people would go on about, essentialism. Can you really attribute an essence to anything? And particularly in kind of the French feminist movement, this is always a question. Is a woman? You see what I mean? Is there a womanness of a woman? Is there a manness of me or Mark or whatever? Is there an essential thing there? And they would challenge that and say no, because then you're just you're creating this metaphysical abstract category, and you're sort of forgetting the reality in front of you. So that, there's a connection there about the use of this therefore. Just because Mark's a man, is there a sort of intrinsic manness to him? All right, maybe not, but we're attributing something by saying that. And that's why I'm interested in the therefore. I am pink, therefore I am spam. Of course, Simon, terrible philosophy on your part. You'd absolutely never make it certainly not into one of Mark's classes, because there's no natural deduction there. That's, you're using deductive logic to disguise something which is purely inductive, because lots of things are pink and not spam. So, but absolutely, Simon, right to the back of the class. But what he's done there, and here's a word for the day, Simon has just ergotized. Ergotize was a word I came across while reading, like, the kind of nerdy things I read, the kind of Scrabble words of the year or something from some championship a few years ago. To ergotize is to argue rationally and make deductions, to use therefore, because in Latin the word ergo, and we use it in English, it means therefore. So he's ergotizing there, but false ergotizing. The most famous use of therefore in the whole history of philosophy, maybe ever, is of course the Descartes phrase that you're referring to there. Cogito ergo sum, cogito ergo sum. In fact, Descartes didn't originally write that in Latin. He wrote in French. So it was je pense donc je suis, I think therefore I am. Which sort of sounds a bit, so what maybe to us now. But when Descartes was writing this in the 17th century, it really was a breakthrough, because at the time, it was really, it's hard to generalize about these things really, but it was kind of the birth of science, the birth of measurement, the birth of the, early enlightenment as the ability to measure things empirically and find out what's what. And there was a huge desire to establish certainty, particularly in a world which was beginning, as it, particularly the empires explored the world, to move away from the idea that everything was necessarily set by God and just had to be given. And there may be ways in which human beings themselves could explore and find out what the world was about, and could do experiments and observations and find their own certainties. And so Descartes set about this project of finding out what is the most certain thing there is in the world. Mark mentioned Plato a few minutes ago, and Plato's great, I don't know what we'd call him, teacher, influence, inspirer, Socrates, sort of famously attributed as having said, the only thing of which I can be certain is that I'm certain of nothing. Well, Descartes sort of took this on and said, well, come on, we can do better than this. Surely there are some things we can, incontrovertibly state as true. And so he started this experiment by doubting everything. And, there's a question in the room, are we living in a simulation? Elizabeth Johnson there, are we living in a simulation? Descartes basically asked himself the same question. How do I know this isn't a simulation? How do I know I'm not living in a dream? How do I know I'm real? How do I know I exist? And so on. So he doubted everything around him. But he had this sort of eureka moment that said, well, hang on a minute. If I'm doubting everything, if I'm even doubting I'm existing, then there's a bit of a glass half full in that, to go back to the glass half empty, Simon. The glass half full is, well, if I'm doubting that I'm existing, I must be thinking, because I can't doubt without thinking. And if I'm thinking, I must be existing, because only something which exists can think. So the very action of doubting my existence proves it. So I'm thinking, therefore I'm existing. I think, therefore I am. Je pense donc je suis. So this was a sort of great flourish and sort of the establishing of, the first kind of certainty, I suppose. It's in the history of philosophy, or at least it's sort of narrated like that. So I went on a bit long there, Mark. Apologies.
Well, I pick up on a few threads there. I'd like to return to this question of, is water wet? But take it in a different direction and then link actually to what you were just saying about thinking and being, therefore. I did a physics degree, and another way in which modern science is founded is on the idea that what's sometimes called secondary qualities, after the philosopher John Locke listed them, don't really exist in science, and wetness would be one of these secondary qualities. Basically anything that we subjectively know through the senses, so colour, taste, feeling, hot and cold, all those kind of things don't exist in science. But instead what do are the measurements that Robert was talking about, so the primary qualities. And this has really gripped the modern mind, because the promise of these measurements, these quantities, these primary qualities that seem like they're out there, they can be touched, they can be prodded, they can be cut apart and so on. Unlike a smell that can't really be, or the colour red can't be put in a test tube, is that they deliver objectivity, unlike the subjectivity of our more direct experience. And we have this huge longing, as Robert was saying, for certainty, and have largely banked on objectivity giving us certainty. But what's so extraordinary about this is that to someone before maybe the 17th century, this would have seemed completely bananas, because what they knew was that pre-scientific theories, scientific theories to them, were constantly changing. And if you wanted something that was unchanging, then you would turn inwards and you would reflect on your own experience. And if you do that, you see that beneath the ups and downs, the hubbub of the everyday, there emerges subjective experiences that don't change, such as the experience of being, such as the experience of your mind fitting the cosmos mind, intelligibility. Things can be understood. These kind of background experiences, perceptions that we very easily take for granted in the modern world, and in fact are very inclined now to discount, because we believe that the AI, the artificial intelligence, is going to become cleverer than than we are. And of course, it has nothing of these subjective experiences. Everything the promises can be done objectively, through measurement, through calculation, through logic. And as another founder of the scientific method sought, Francis Bacon, he argued that if you could remove human beings from thinking processes, then those thinking processes would actually get better, because we human beings are so subject to the subjective. But I think that this is a disaster, really serious disaster, for all sorts of reasons, partly because it actually increases uncertainty. And so physicists, quite very serious physicists, can come up with completely bananas ideas, such as, are we living in a simulation, that carry the seeming gloss of being an objective proposal. But also, in terms of our mental health, I think that the fact that we have been taught now for generations to discount our subjective experiences and seek instead objectivity in our lives has alienated us from ourselves. So, you know, it's very common in the therapy room for someone to, rather than talking about their feelings, to talk about, I don't know, a serotonin rush or a dopamine hit, as if they were a chemical reaction. And very often I sit there and think, you know, if you really thought you're a chemical reaction, or are inclined to think that maybe you are, maybe that's a deep part of the reason why you're feeling so depressed or so anxious, like you might get flushed away at any moment. So I'm deeply one for championing the return of the subjective, which most of our ancestors for most of human history would have been the place they looked for certainty. And, you know, I did this physics degree. I'm old enough now to have seen fashions come and go in physics. And when I was doing my undergraduate degree, there were still serious physicists who believed the Big Bang, for example, didn't really exist. And then the Big Bang became very, very fashionable through the 90s and the early part of the millennium. But now it's routinely questioned by physicists again. The seeming objective certainties of science come and go remarkably quickly. But what doesn't are the inward experiences of what it's to be human, which is why, for example, we can still read Plato now, who wrote 2,500 years ago, and get a huge amount from it, but no undergraduate physicists would read Newton.
Fascinating. Mark, I want to, I'm going to ask you a follow-up question on that, and then I want to come to Hazel's question on non-competitive societies. And Alexis, kudos to you for the riposte there, but if water makes things wet, then surely it can make itself wet. Love that comment. And we've got one on suicide, which I'm interested in too. But Mark, I just wanted to ask you then, so I hear the passion in what you're saying and the kind of campaigning zeal for recognition of the subjective. But I've been studiously avoiding this Harry and Meghan documentary on Netflix. And you and I are obviously no experts on celebrities. We know that. But this phrase has started to really bug me. Speaking my truth, speaking their truth, Harry and Meghan speaking their truth. And I just wanted to ask you about that, how you hear that phrase, you know, because you're in psychotherapy as well. You have people speaking their truth the whole time. But to me, it's become hijacked as a sort of an excuse for self-pity or victimization and so on. So what do you think about that?
I think one of the things that's going on with Harry meeting Meghan is that two psychological cultures are actually kind of colliding. And certainly this side of the Atlantic, phrases like speaking your truth feel awkward, if not deeply unpleasant. And there's actually a bit of history through the 20th century of psychology here, because one of the things that happened when psychoanalysis went to the US is there was a huge movement in what's sometimes called self-psychology. And this was broadly the idea that we're atomized individuals that must make it in our own lives by telling a good enough story of who we are. And that then bolsters the ego to meet whatever life might throw at us. And so the ideal for a lot of psychology in the US is the capacity to speak your truth. And, you know, it's no coincidence that the confessional chat show and so on was born in the US out of this heartfelt and sincere sense that to be able to tell your story is absolutely crucial to being happy. But in old Europe, this was always a bit more of a suspect idea, perhaps because of a consciousness of history that bit more. Someone mentioned ancestors earlier in the chat there and about how things are passed down. And I think in Europe, there's always been this sense that we're actually, well, a positive way of putting it would be to say, well, actually more than ourselves. The truth that I can speak is always only going to be a kind of fragment of the truth that might be said. And so in Western psychotherapy in Europe, the ways that one can look at that which you don't understand, that which you can't be certain about, but comes to you, say, through your dreams, that must be tried and tested and discerned, or through ancestry, through looking back into the past and feeling the presence of the past upon you. And that has always obtained a lot more. And I think that, one of the sort of subtler reasons, but it's very profound because it's about our sense of ourselves, that the whole Harry-Meghan thing feels like it clashes so much, is this sort of clash of understanding of how we get to a sense of ourselves that divided by a common language.
Yeah, fascinating, Mark. Yes, I do want to have a go at Hazel's question here about whether a non-competitive society can be successful and happy, to sort of go into a slightly more political register. But just, Peter, a narcissist speaking their truth is surely a lie in the wider scope. Well, maybe. I think there's probably annoyingly sort of pedantic of me to point this out, but in the world of psychoanalysis, actually narcissism isn't, the word narcissist isn't quite used in the way we sort of tend to use it more in a more everyday sense these days. We tend to think of a narcissist as just somebody with a big ego, or deceived because they're so sort of taken up with themselves, or self-important, or vain, or what have you. But certainly for Freud, who is responsible for the term or repurposing the term from the myth in Ovid, it's sort of anything but that. The narcissist is the person who's actually incapable of achieving a sense of self, because when the beautiful Greek youth Narcissus looks into the pool of water and sees his reflection in the water and reaches out to kiss him, the image dissolves, and he's incapable of making that gesture of sort of closure, if you like. So for Freud, at least, narcissists are rather sort of tragic figures who have anything but a self. Of course, you could still explain vain people in that way, that they have to go out of their way to try and find a sense of self by in an overbearing or sort of sickly way, sort of reintroducing themselves into all the kind of corners of conversations. But anyway, maybe that's a slightly pedantic point.
Yeah, no, insisting that a whole nation is in the service of their will, for example, would be a narcissistic trait. Yes. What in psychotherapy would be called a phallic narcissistic trait, moreover. But anyway, let's go to this non-competitive society and success.
Yeah, that's okay. I don't know what you're thinking about this. I was thinking about Thomas Hobbes, maybe because we had Descartes earlier, and Thomas Hobbes is broadly a contemporary of Descartes. And in fact was writing in France during the English Civil War. And because of the English Civil War, he was thinking a lot about competition and how we best organize society in order to avoid war, actually, was sort of where he was coming from. And what he basically started out with was a theory of human nature. And it most famously, he said, if you leave people on to themselves, you'll end up with this famous quote, the war of all against all. And he, another famous phrase, he says, the life of natural man, in other words, yes, people left to their own devices, is nasty, brutish, and short. So not pleasant altogether. So we would compete with one another. In fact, to the point of internecine strife, we'd tear each other to bits. It would be a kind of carnage, essentially. So, competition, at least for Hobbes, is the most natural state. So obviously, there are other thinkers who think the reverse. But what's interesting is the solution he comes up with, which he bases on this biblical figure, sort of quite terrifying figure of the Leviathan, which means a whale, sort of mythological whale, like sort of Moby Dick or something. But the idea is this is a huge sort of presence. And what he was trying to do was really reconcile democracy with monarchy? How on earth do you have those two things? Because of course that's what the Civil War was about, essentially. How do you have a king and have a populace at the same time who want to have more of a say? That's sort of obviously reducing it all to very simple terms. And his proposal was this, what he called the Leviathan, which is basically a voted for dictator. So people get together and essentially agree that they need someone to sort them out. It's like a group of toddlers saying, yeah, we need the nursery nurse in the room, otherwise it's going to be mayhem. So it's a very sort of interesting compromise, I suppose, for want of a better word, between these two systems, democracy and monarchy or authority, but based on the idea that we can't have harmony by ourselves, because we would just compete. And actually what secures being successful and happy, Hazel, in your question there, and this goes very much against this, particularly sort of liberal people in the West like us, goes very much against the idea of the strong leader. But he's basically saying, if you want happy people, you've got to have a strong leader.
Yeah, this is a really pressing question, and perhaps even links to Martin's remark there about fuel poverty in this way, perhaps, because I think that perhaps one of the things that's really happening in politics now is that the promise that politicians will steadily, year on year, increase our material well-being and our physical health as well is starting to look increasingly difficult to deliver. And I think that the cost of living crisis and related issues which feel so palpable in the UK at least, they have the you might call this sort of imminent problem that may or may not be solvable, but perhaps there's a deeper structural issue going on that the promise of politics, certainly say since the Second War, is starting to look undeliverable, because that kind of material increase or progress is harder and harder to keep on delivering. And I think that this relates to Thomas Hobbes, and maybe I could bring in, since we were talking about South London earlier on, the great mystic of South London, William Blake, who lived in Lambeth. And Blake, I think, had a deep perception about the nature of a competitive society, which in the 18th century, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, he really saw taking off, not just in, as it were, people's hearts, but shaping the landscape with the dark satanic mills. And what Blake realised is that we are being sold a fool's game with this stress on competition and success, and then linking that to happiness, as if the more that we have, the more successful we are, and competition's needed to drive that so that there's the greatest happiness for the greatest number. Because Blake realised that the human mind, the human soul, actually doesn't long just for more and more and more stuff, the kind of increase, the accumulation of bits and bobs, but rather longs to be in touch with what he called the all, the idea that we human beings don't just love finite things, but have a sense and taste for the infinite, another idea from the Romantic movement. And that unless we educate ourselves to be able to participate in the all, in life itself, in those kind of things which don't run down when they're shared, but actually grow as they're shared around. And, love would be the obvious example there. Unless we have an education system that helps us to appreciate that, society would indeed turn in on itself and gobble itself up in the quest to accumulate this and that more and more, under the false pretense that this is going to deliver happiness. And so perhaps William Blake is someone who we need to turn to, along with others who've pointed this out, and with some force, I think, actually reject the Thomas Hobbesian view that the natural state of human beings is war of all against all. Look what it's doing to us, William Blake would say, and it's not delivering what it promises, because, he thought, the human mind has this incredible imaginative capacity to sort of leave itself, to know that which is not part of itself, and even ultimately to be able to have some kind of experience of life as a whole, and the infinite as well as finite things.
Thank you for that, Mark. And I can see, Ben, you just popped up again with perfect timing as Mark was rounding off his point there.
Oh, that was very fortuitous. It's sort of, you have to sort of stumble on like a unwanted stagehand on this platform. You can't sort of enter gracefully. It's either all or nothing. Excuse me. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for this amazing slam. It's the first ever slam that we've had. As we draw to a close, I don't want the questions quite finished just yet. I thought we would sort of sign off with opening up the Inrehearsal community to perhaps pitch in with any questions they might want to ask you about your practice, about your writing, about the work that you're doing in organizations, with individuals, and perhaps how might they collaborate with you, Mark, or you, Robert. So, and I guess to kind of kick things off as these thank yous and the well wishes come in, one thing I've learned from both of you is that there's always something in the offing. So what are we working on at the moment? I know, let's pick on Mark. It seems nice and mean given he's just released his book. What are you currently working on at the moment, Mark?
Well, as is the way with books, you kind of write them and then they don't appear for a year or something, and by which time you're already on to your next thing, and you have to wind yourself back and ask yourself, what was I thinking about when I wrote that thing? But I'm sort of, in a way, it's a development of spiritual intelligence that I'm working on now, alongside the psychotherapy practice and then doing writing and gigs with Robert and so on. Is thinking about William Blake, because I feel he has a really sharp analysis of what's happening in our times, which he saw beginning to unmerge in his, and also a way of trying to expand our imaginations again, which I feel is increasingly necessary given the various crises which we face immediately, but feel like they're only going to become more and more challenging down the line.
So you're taking on the challenge of expanding one's imagination. Sounds like another book, doesn't it?
I'm trying to work on the title, so I might have to make a note of that just in case it's the one that clicks.
We'll get some.
And what about you, Robert?
Well, the last thing I wrote actually was a Christmas card this morning. But I am working on a complete departure for me, actually, because I've only ever written non-fiction in the past, mainly sort of philosophy and psychology type things. But I'm chancing my arm for the first time at a novel. Everyone's got to write one, haven't they? And not just a novel, but a funny novel, well, allegedly in intention. And not just a funny one, but a romantic one. So romanticism certainly isn't dead on my computer screen. I'm writing a romantic comedy, would you believe? And, very much in the spirit of all those romantic comedy films that, I used to watch with my daughters when they were growing up, like Love Actually and Four Weddings and Funerals. So that's what I'm doing, rather implausibly. But at the same time, of course, I'm carrying on being extremely serious and important and doing all the other work that I'm doing, particularly this thing I mentioned called Constellations, which is a way of looking at hidden dynamics in either family systems, so it's a bit like psychotherapy, or in businesses and organizations. So those are my sort of two main shticks at the moment.
There's always something on the go, which is very inspiring. And I'm going to put you both on the spot as we come to a close. There's some really nice thank you messages that are coming in on the chat, but to kind of put you on the spot, I don't think any community event is ever complete without a sense of panic when Ben asks a question that you weren't expecting. But I think what's been really inspiring working with both of you during the process of preparing and creating your box sets, and what I go away kind of my mind whirring, is the ability for you to have an original thought or a thought on that. So Donna's just asked a great question, but I'm going to ask my question. I'll come back to Donna, so I'll give you some time to kind of mull it over. I'm presuming your brain can do two things at once. Mine can't, but I would have thought yours could. How do you create the environment for yourself as an individual to have that type of insight? How do you give yourself permission? How do you find a way to create original thought, original ideas? Maybe if someone wants to practice something over the Christmas break, what might that look like for them? But before we get into that question, so you can do some sort of unconscious, subconscious mulling over. Donna's asked a question. I presume that's for you, Robert, on...
Yes, I do them online and in person, actually. I was doing them in person last night, but I do them online, and I guess if you want to find out more, just email me. You can, I don't know, Google me or something or whatever. But happy to follow up with you on that. Yeah.
You both have got good web presences, so I'll promote that for you both. So you've both got your own homepages that you can kind of follow and reach out directly to, on the constellations piece with Robert, and of course Mark on his work on spiritual intelligence as well. So great content that you can tap into there, and of course, check out the on-demand videos here. But yeah, going back to, this is the great thing about hosting the community event, is that you can ask whatever questions you want to ask. Yeah, if I want unique perspective or new ideas or something that kind of lands with me that almost gives me a bit of a step change, makes me stumble in my thought, how do I allow that in? What can I do?
I mean, I think one way of doing it is to read a bit of a great thinker. And by that I mean someone who just doesn't offer comment on a particular issue, this or that. But the kind of person who, the minute you start reading them, you realize you're entering a whole worldview, a whole zeitgeist or moment, and then run with that sense of their work. It may be a great 18th century novelist. It may be, in my case, particularly was Plato. And you start to get a sense of sort of who they are and how they might have responded and what assumptions they work with, which are often very different from the ones that you have to that moment, at least. And then this creates this kind of ripple effect where you can play with what they might have said. And I think that that's something that Robert and I share. Sometimes we say that I tend to have a foot in ancient philosophy, Robert more has a foot in modern philosophy. But nonetheless, the point is that if you expose yourselves, not to kind of Twitter, the whole point is made in 128 characters or whatever it is now, which is always a rather narrow way to approach things, but instead read an expansive thinker or writer. They give you a whole world, not just one particular thought.
Great. So welcoming new ideas, new perspective by seeking out the original thought of perhaps people that are very different to you or have very unique perspectives. And Robert, what would you suggest?
I sort of take the inverse view, which is, Mark suggesting kind of reaching outside ourselves for something different. I'd say there's a lot of material within us that we ignore. I mean, Mark was talking about spiritual intelligence and embodied knowing. There's all sorts of data that we have that we choose to deselect or not follow, whether it's intuition or fear or whatever. And we will tend to say, well, that's not rational. Let's put it to one side. And I would say I'd sort of up the ante a bit and say, pay attention to your dreams, because I think dreams give us two things. One is they give us a very insightful report on our state of mind, where we are that day or that night. And often I find the imagery in a dream can often give us a clue as to the next step. So I completely agree with what Mark said in terms of reaching outside ourselves, but I think we can all of us get better at learning what we have within ourselves and kind of mining that resource a bit better.
That's a nice plug as well for, I believe, is sort of our innovation video, Robert, where we're talking about tuning into our perhaps darker thoughts, our kind of subversive thoughts, and what that might be telling us. And that was something that really stuck with me when we were creating those videos. And great. Well, and I like Robert's homework because that feels like I can just sort of, I feel like I'm less doing. Yeah.
Sleep at the same time.
Yeah, exactly. I can have a little snooze and be doing some meaningful work. Gents, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a real treat for our community to have you here. Just having that time with you, it's been amazing. I'm very captivating to listen how you jump from topic to topic. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks, Ben, for organising and bringing people together, and so we can have this exchange.
Yeah, it's been amazing. I think can't wait to hear what the offline comments are going to be and the feedback. I know it's going to be amazing. Thank you so much, Inrehearsal community, for joining us. We're pretty much closing business shortly for the new year, not forever, but for Christmas. So have a wonderful Christmas and New Year for those of you who are taking a holiday. Thank you so much for joining us, and we'll see you again at our next In-Rehearsal community event. Thank you so much all. Take care.